The story of how Capitol Hill Baptist Church's first pastor became convinced of the necessity of Christian abolitionism is a remarkable case study in the incompatibility of Christianity and slavery. Joseph Parker was born in Vermont in 1805. He grew up in a godly home and was converted in his teen years. He wondered if the Lord was calling him to ministry, but first he did what many aspiring preachers did at the time. He became a school teacher. He moved down south to Virginia to take a job working for a plantation owner, a man named Nicholas Edmonds, who owned a massive plantation. It was Parker's first encounter with slavery. He had always assumed that slavery was a necessary evil. It had existed for a long time. It wasn't a particularly good thing, but there was nothing to do now that it existed. It was his first-hand encounters with slavery and the sinister effects it had on professing Christians that convinced him otherwise. Parker was encouraged by the plantation owner at first to share the gospel widely with slaves as he taught school. Many of the slaves were converted, and Parker led Bible studies and worship gatherings among the slaves. He also witnessed to Edmonds' children, and many of Edmonds' children became Christians. At one point, the normally reserved Mr. Edmonds fell around the young man Parker's neck and almost wept for joy and told him, "Oh, Parker, everything I know and love in life, I have thanks to you," meaning the salvation of his children. This continued for some time until Nat Turner's revolt in 1831, a slave uprising that threw Virginia into chaos. The result of that was that the southern states, including Virginia, passed some of the strictest anti-literacy laws for slaves, including banning religious gatherings for slaves. Shortly after, at breakfast one morning, Edmonds, the plantation owner, sat down with Mr. Parker and said, "Mr. Parker, you must cease evangelizing the slaves." Parker was shocked at this. He asked him why, and Edmonds explained. He said, "You remember the other day when there was a funeral and one of the slaves stood exhorting the other slaves and telling them they must prepare to meet their God?" He said, that slave feels as if he is beholden to God. And it is a very different thing to be beholden to God and to be beholden to man. Say you go down to the slave quarters tonight and you read to them that passage from the Sermon on the Mount, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." If they ask you, "Now, please, Mr. Parker, would you say that Nicholas Edmonds does unto us as he would have us do unto him?" You must answer him one of two ways. Either you say yes, and they lie, and you can do them no spiritually good. Or you say no, and you sully my reputation and undermine my leadership of the plantation. No, you must resist teaching them entirely. At this, Parker stirred. He said, "Mr. Edmonds, would you understand that Christ has entrusted to us a gospel which must be preached to all creatures? And that apart from this hearing and believing this gospel, people are consigned to hell eternally? And you would have me refrain from preaching this gospel to your slaves?" "That's exactly what I mean," said Mr. Edmonds. "But sir," pressed Parker, "can you stand the blazing fire of judgment and the one who has entrusted you with this authority and believe that you will be able to stand on that day of wrath, withholding preaching the gospel from those entrusted to your care?" At this, Mr. Edmonds burst into tears. He said, "For God's sake, Mr. Parker, do not speak to me of that day of judgment, but you must refrain from teaching my slaves." From that moment on, it became crystal clear to Parker that slavery and Christianity were fundamentally unreconcilable. And this is because of two absolute necessities in Christianity. One, the gospel must be preached to all people. And secondly, as Christians, we have to treat all believers as our brothers and sisters, which completely undermines race-based slavery. Shortly after that, Edmonds told Parker that he had to leave. He required him to leave his plantation. Parker went on to become a leading Baptist theologian, an advocate for abolition, and the pastor of many prominent churches. And one of the last churches that he pastored was the Capitol Baptist Church in Washington, D.C. But thanks to those early experiences and what God revealed him in his word, Parker became absolutely convinced of the necessity of Christian abolition.